Happy Friday, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to Dope People. My man DJ O getting us started. Much appreciated.
Thank you guys, as always. It's my pleasure. I'm excited for the session today.
Absolutely, man. Just getting the vibe started. I could listen to your music all day. Uh,
Thank you,
and now
bro.
I'm glad that we've been sharing your playlists afterwards. So tune
Facts.
in. We'll be sending
Yeah,
those links.
for sure.
Once again, thank you for joining, everybody. Thanks for the people on Facebook, on Zoom, that watch on YouTube. This is Dope People. I'm Jacoby Holland. We just want to feature dope people throughout the industry, people we think are doing amazing things. We want to highlight them and bring them to you guys to hear their stories. As always, I have my co-hosts with me, Peter and Lulu. Peter, what's happening?
What's up? What's up? Nice to see everybody here this Friday afternoon. I'm really excited to get into this one today. I have a particular passion as a biochemist for herbs and Eastern medicine. So I'm very, very excited to have Katie with us here today.
I can attest to that. Peter is our resident nerd. We're all nerds. Peter above all, for sure.
Peter especially. Hi, everyone. Greetings from Mexico. I'm really excited about today also. Like Jacoby said, we're all a little bit of a nerd group, and I'm super excited to have Katie on. I first met Katie when I was doing an article for How Things Are Made, and I really wanted to feature women scientists in cannabis. It took me a month to find 7 women to feature in that article. Katie is one of them, and I think it's just really amazing with her background, being a scientist with lab experience, also being an herbalist, and now an expert extractor in the cannabis space. So Katie, welcome from Portland, CEO of Peak Extracts and woman in cannabis I very much admire. So welcome. How are things going in Portland?
Thanks for the welcome. Things are going great. The weather here is gorgeous. I mean, of course, we've been dealing with a lot of intense protesting for the last many months. It's been more than intense, I should say, but you know, we're holding on.
Absolutely. And I mean, that brings me to the first point. I can't get this started without mentioning some of the things that are going on in the world. As a Black man, this stuff, I feel it in my bones. And I just want to, shout out to the family of Jacob Blake. The things that are going on in our world are, in a sense, I want to say crazy, but I think thank you to the internet and smartphones, like this shit ain't new. And I'm glad that people are seeing it happening, unfortunately, but being activated by it. And, I just want to send my thoughts and prayers to their family. I know they're going through a lot, and they're doing bold things, trying to make sure their story is heard and understood. So, I wanted to get it started off with that. Lulu, Peter, if you guys want to say anything.
Yeah, I'm just kind of looking at things from an international perspective right now. We've been in Mexico, and I'm just kind of like aghast at that, the privilege that comes. It's like, do people not see what's happening in the world? Like, how is this still happening after all of the protests? I do feel hopeful. I feel that this is a movement that is going to be happening, and it keeps me thinking to like Braveheart, where the queen was like, you are the last generation of this. I have a new seed that's going to have a totally different opinion. And I'm just, yeah, I feel so awful. I can't even imagine or compare it to what's happening to these families. But I do have hope that this is the last generation that's going to be thinking like this. And on an international side of things, everyone is aghast. So I think we can definitely do better. And I'm actually very excited about November and what's going to be coming in 2021.
Yeah, these are dark times. but I have hope in the fact that this is a conversation that has been ignited a few times now throughout the years. And the momentum with 2020, I really do think people are mobilizing in more creative, productive ways. For instance, there's a lot more entrepreneurship and empowerment in terms of a lot of people like investing in the stock market right now. And I think that mobilization and organizing is really what is going to continue past whatever happens in the election and through, because there will be more events like this, and it is unfortunate. But to resonate with some of the things Lulu was saying on the international stage, I know France and South Africa have had particular uprisings in response to Jacob's shooting, and I think there is hope on an international level for change and pressure in the United States to do something meaningful.
And I saw a tweet, and I won't quote it directly, but it was like hours after this video went viral, that instantly brought up his background and his history of doing things that society is deemed inappropriate, and violence, whatever. And I just encourage everybody to not believe that somebody's background or history or mistakes or poor circumstances should give anybody permission to unjustly take their life or attempt to. And in this case, he is still alive, thank goodness, under completely different circumstances than he'll ever be able to live. But there's no justification for the people that we pay to protect us to put us in those situations, no matter what our backgrounds. And so I encourage you, if you think otherwise, to check your bias, right? We all deserve the pursuit of happiness and life and liberty in this country.
Yeah, 8 shots in the back. I don't even think police officers are supposed to be shooting anyone on the back in the backside. So that is just that's complete bullshit. So, and it's creating another generation of trauma because he was shot in front of his kids. It's completely inappropriate. And I think what you said is truly clear. It doesn't really matter what you do as a human being. No one deserves to be treated like that by the people that we use our tax money to protect.
Absolutely. So I'm going to change it up a little bit here, switch over to Peter and talk about some other things that are going in the news in this past week. I know we have some interesting things you sent me.
Yeah, so I'm gonna hit you with one that I didn't get to send you because it is that hot. I just got an email about the MORES Act. It is official. There will be a vote next session in September. Majority Whip James Clyburn sent an email out that it is to be expected that there be a vote on the MORES Act. So very exciting. We've been talking about the hype building up to it, but it's official. September, we'll see some movement there. I encourage everyone to go check out the MORES Act and read it. There are a lot more restorative justice programs and social equity programs in it, such as national expungement to a certain degree, that I think will move things and help usher in some healing.
Interesting. My reaction is it's interestingly timely because of Kamala's current situation, right? I think she's the sponsor of this. So,
in the Senate, yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's probably not a coincidence, but I'm not mad at it.
Yeah. Other news, as everyone knows, there's a series of wildfires throughout Northern California. And these fires are getting to some cannabis farms out there. And something just to note that because of restrictions and laws, these farmers don't have insurance and other protections in place that other farmers would have. So there might be a switch up, or this is going to negatively impact the California cannabis industry for years to come. On another note, rapper Raekwon from the Wu-Tang Klang has announced an initiative and invested a significant amount into the company called Citizen Grown, which will be providing kind of like incubators for at-home grows, which is very interesting. And his push is that cannabis is for the people and by the people. And with this business model, he kind of allows that to really happen. So pretty cool.
I'm waiting for the tech billionaires to come up with money to help with the fire departments. I would love to see Elon Musk drop a couple million to bring in some planes to drop some water on those fires. I would love to see Mark, what's his face? Can't stand him. Bring in some Facebook money to support all of the local things that are happening. I mean, you're in Silicon Valley. This is your community. It's time to put your money where your mouth is.
Colorado's burning too, if we're throwing money out. Just want to throw that out there.
You guys are burning too? Damn.
And another move towards some policy changes that will actually have some meaningful impact in the lives of people of color. The governor of Pennsylvania, Tim Wolf, announced that he is going to try and push within his state for more comprehensive and to legalization of recreational marijuana throughout the state. And he hopes that the tax revenue from this new industry and the fact that it'll generate a lot more small business and entrepreneurship in the state. And he wants it to fund restorative justice programs. So this is just one domino, one state that hopefully sees cannabis as an opportunity to recover and provide healing in a myriad ways. So hopefully some other states will follow suit soon and make similar announcements.
Yeah, I would like to see somebody do a report, it might even exist, on the reasons cannabis was legalized and what and the promises that were made and where that money really went. I know in Colorado, a big chunk of it was to go to the schools. I know a lot of people in schools, my girlfriend's a teacher, and they felt that they did not get that cash. So I'd really like to see that paper trail of how cannabis has been used as some great rhetoric, but actually how it's implemented.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think there are some studies out there. Maybe next time I could give a little quick summary on some of those or put it in our newsletter.
Right on. Maybe even our LinkedIn group. If you're not in our LinkedIn group, you should be. Anyways, thank you, Peter. Let's switch gears here. We have our awesome guest who knows a ton about a ton when it comes to plants and herbs and strains. And I could feel Peter beaming all week thinking about the conversation we're going to have. So, Katie, just get us started here. How did you get into this? First, you were in, I think, Chinese herbal medicine before this whole cannabis push. I'm not quite sure. How did we get started here?
Well, I moved to Portland in 2005. I'd been working in labs for a while, and I took a job at OHSU doing natural products research in the neurology department, working on MS. And so that was where I got sort of a taste for the differences between whole herbs and herbal extracts in terms of efficacy and tolerability. And then after that, I went into Chinese medicine, but all through that, I was still growing cannabis. I started growing cannabis in 2005 in the medical program when it was still really inchoate here. There were only 10 different qualifying conditions, and I had one of them, which is Crohn's. And there were just not that many people that were in the medical community at that point. And so I continued in that community and then got my degree in Chinese medicine. And then in 2014, I started Peak Extracts. And so it sort of was like strands weaving together between my laboratory science background and my Chinese herbal medicine background in cannabis.
Love it. What gets you started in studying Chinese herbal medicine?
It was actually fairly selfish. I was hitting a wall with my Western therapies, and I went to an acupuncturist because I ruptured my Achilles tendon, and that's just a brutal recovery. And they suggested, my Western doctors suggested I get acupuncture because it's like a year of pretty severe pain and a lot of scarring. And so that's how I got introduced to acupuncture, was through an orthopedic issue. And then after I got some results with the Achilles tendon, my acupuncturist suggested I try herbs for my Crohn's disease, and that was a life-changing event for me. I was able to get my Crohn's symptoms under control really quickly comparatively, and I was able to get off of the Western drugs that were making me worse at that point. And so I sort of changed my life path, and instead of going into either a medical program, or I was about to go into a PhD program in neurophysiology, I just derailed it and went and got a degree in Chinese medicine instead.
That's super cool.
Yeah, no, I love that. I mean, as someone who is Chinese, I think it's just beautiful that you are someone that's open to Eastern kind of preventative things in treatment, and also being able to combine that with, you know, Western science. We don't really see a lot of that on the East Coast. I see a lot more of that in, you know, California, Oregon, Washington. So how has that helped with kind of formulating for your products? Because you guys have some really amazing edibles that Peter was actually able to get some when he was in Portland. How has that helped kind of reframe or change the way that you approach things?
Well, I mean, I got started in college. I did some extractions. I did my first cannabis extraction in college using butane and hexane. And then I did some other plant extractions for use in pharmacological studies in college and after college. And then with OHSU, that was where I really got into the herbs and extractions of herbs. And then with the Chinese medicine, it's super informative because so many of the things, especially there's a certain category of herbs that are short cook, they're really terpene based. I mean, a lot of the pharmacologically active substances in Chinese herbs are terpenes, but especially the aromatic ones. And so there's parameters for extraction on all of those herbs. And so it was really helpful for me to go back and look at the parameters for extracting for like mint and dongwei and stuff like that, because then that tells me some of this can be applied to cannabis in terms of making sure that we get those desirable compounds.
Are you still using propane and hexane for extraction, or are you ethanol, CO2 route type of for cannabis? What's your take on that?
For all of our edible products, we're using CO2. We decided early on in 2014 that we were gonna not use hydrocarbons. I think they make a beautiful extract, but the explosivity and also the environmental impact is just too great for us to stomach it. And in Oregon, it's not easy to properly and legally dispose of your spent material if you use hydrocarbons. Because the incinerating facility is in Washington. And so technically you're like violating the Cole memo because you're not stripping the material entirely of cannabinoids. Besides which, we run our material through the CO2 machine and then we take it to a farm and it's composted, and they're thrilled to have it because it's still nutrient rich. It just doesn't have the cannabinoids in it. And so there's this nice cycle of life where we just get it from the farm, extract it, take it back to the farm. And that just felt way better to me. And I just don't want to work with those chemicals anymore. Like I put my time in 10 years in a lab of tinkering with volatile, scary chemicals. I'm done.
Yeah, I've spent a solid amount of time close to closed loop systems. I was not the type of person that wanted to run those. But I do see that there's a question from our attendees, a hand raised. So I just want to encourage you, use the Q&A. I see it's here and we're going to get to some of your questions for anybody else that wants to ask. But here's a great one. Is there any way to build a hydrocarbon-based extraction process that can scale?
Yeah, sure. There are giant hydrocarbon-based extraction systems. A lot of them are similar to the one that we have, where you're investing at least 6 figures, but they have enormous throughput. But they just have to be, welded and manufactured to some really specific parameters so you don't go boom.
Yes, that being the key there if you're using hexane or butane or something, right?
Yeah.
The most important part. So what are the differences in the actual output?
So in between the different solvents,
Yeah.
So I think about it as like a combination between specificity and volatility, because you want something that will pull everything you want out of the cannabis. So that's primarily the cannabinoids, the terpenes, and to a certain extent the flavonoids. And then you want it to leave everything you don't want, like the cellulose, which is basically wood, and the chlorophyll. And so with ethanol, it's very good at pulling the cannabinoids, but it's warmer, and so it loses the terpenes most often, and it also pulls the chlorophyll really nicely. The hydrocarbons are great because they leave the waxes, they leave the chlorophyll alone, they leave the cellulose alone, and they pull the terpenes and the cannabinoids. But then the downside is, of course, the volatility and the toxic nature of some of them. And CO2 was a good choice for us because it does pull, it's very specific, and it's extremely volatile. Like it's a gas at room temperature. And so once you do your extraction, the CO2 is really easy to purge. Whereas with butane hexane, you do have to do a little extra work and purge it under a vacuum oven. And so the CO2 will pull what we want, which is the flavonoids, the terpenes, the cannabinoids, and it'll leave the rest alone. And with our new parameters, we're obviously constantly refining them, but we've been working on this for 5 years now, and we're down to almost no waxes, really high terpene contents, good flavonoid contents, and great cannabinoid ratios. So we're stoked on it. You know, it's something, CO2 has such an enormous broad range of solubility. You can dissolve cannabinoids in like 900 PSI all the way up to like 3000 PSI or more. And so you can tweak a lot of really cool things with CO2. So it's kind of a nerd's dream. You can look at the lab tests and you can tweak and change it. And of course, every strain is different too in terms of the way that it extracts. And so it's been a fun journey there.
How do you feel about adding back terpenes?
I'm not opposed to it in general. I think it's better to have them because of the entourage effect, which I'm sure we'll get into a little bit later. I don't like it as much though, because in my experience with a number of applications, it's better to leave them than it is to pull them and reintroduce them, because you're getting a lot of other things that we're probably not even realizing is there, like other constituent chemicals. And so the closer you can get to a whole plant extract, the better, in my opinion. But I still think that it's better to add them back at the end than not have them at all.
So I have questions on that, but I want to rewind just a little bit here. Can you break down the importance or the value of the cannabinoids, the flavonoids, and the terpenes, and the difference in each?
Yeah, so the cannabinoids are the chemicals that are almost always unique to cannabis, and they're pharmacologically active. Not to say that they're all psychoactive, because that's definitely not true, but they're called cannabinoids because they're in cannabis, and they don't, with a couple of really minor exceptions, they don't exist anywhere else in any other plants. Whereas the terpenes are volatile, smelly chemicals that are pretty much ubiquitous in the plant kingdom. They're in tons of plants and in fairly large concentrations. And so the terpenes are what make different cultivars or chemovars happen in cannabis. And they also are pharmacologically active. And so they often change the way that we experience the high or the medicinal effects of cannabis. The flavonoids are most often antioxidants. So they're like what makes blueberries really good for you. They're coloring compounds often, and they can be very rarely pharmacologically active, but mostly they act as antioxidants. So it's never a bad idea to eat antioxidants because we're surrounded by a lot of oxidative stress in our lives. And so there's a lot of good that can be taken from flavonoids.
Okay, so we have our three components here that we're trying to extract. And how does the different cultivar or the different strains come into play here?
So every different cultivar or strain or chemovar, depending on your perspective, they have a different profile of all three of those things. Some plants are higher in THCV or CBG or CBD. Those are all cannabinoids. And some of them have different terpene profiles or flavonoid profiles. And we're really just scratching the surface. We've only had access to a 42 terpene analysis for the last 2 to 3 years. And so we thought we were getting about 5% terpene retention. And then we added on 20 new terpenes and we realized we were getting like 10 to 15% terpene retention because there was just a bunch of terpenes we weren't studying. And there's probably more. I mean, there's definitely more than 42. And so we're still learning all the terpenes, and each different cultivar, you can tell by the way it smells. Every strain almost smells different. And you can see some different similarities, like the blueberry strains smell similar, etc. But it's just the genetic backbone and the phenotypic backbone. You know, there are different phenotypes of the same plant, which is a different genetic expression. And so like one blue dream will throw more blueberry than haze, and you can tell by the smell, but you can also tell by analyzing the extract.
I have a question about like classification of strains, right? We had indica, we had sativa, we had hybrid. What's your feelings on that? Are we gonna get more classification? Should we have more classifications around that? Like, what are your thoughts around those two?
So, I mean, I love to nerd out about this stuff. Obviously, this is like literally my jam. I like to think about it more in terms of their backbones with the landrace strains, as opposed to indica versus sativa, although that can sometimes be useful, but often, like, for instance, my dog is a Labradoodle, but he looks like a poodle. Like, you're gonna throw different genetic profiles. Like I act like my aunt. I look more like my aunt than my mom. And so that's kind of what happens with cannabis too. And so it's more useful to look at the family tree. And is everyone familiar with landrace strains? I could explain that a little bit. Maybe I should.
Educate.
So, cannabis ended up at all corners of the world many thousands of years ago and was able to adapt to different climatic conditions, different pests, different sunlight levels, different elevation levels. And so there's a handful of what are called landrace strains. And so they adapted to their climates. Like Durban poison is from South Africa. Hindu Kush is from the Hindu Kush mountains. Lamb's bread is from Jamaica. Colombian gold, Panama red. I'm sure there's a few that I'm missing, but I've found those to be a really interesting journey to try on their own and to see kind of what the skeletons of all of our current strains, because most of all of our current strains are made from those land races mixed together in different quantities. And so you can sort of, it's by looking at their like great grandparents that you can sort of tell what they are doing. And there's big differences in height, in phenotypic expression, and chemical expression from all of those different ones. And so whenever I select a strain, I like to go back to whatever landrace they started from, if we know. And then I can sort of make a determination on how it's going to feel and what it's going to do in terms of terpenes.
Where do you go for that resource of wanting to go back in history for all of that?
I love the Seed Finder web app. It's a British website that I've been using for forever. I think it's like eu.seedfinder. And it will go back as far as we know. And sometimes they'll say, you know, obscure strain, no idea, you know, but often they'll be able to take you all the way back to like Thai or, you know, Hawaiian. There we go. It's fun.
Okay, so you said we have these land races, right? We have our 3 main things that we're trying to pull out of the plant. What I want to ask about the terpenes here. You said that this can affect the way we feel or the, I don't know if it's the high, but it has an effect to us. What is that effect?
It's super variable, and we're dealing with polypharmacy, right? Like there's multiple things that are acting on our receptors, and there's multiple things that are acting on our metabolism of the different pharmacologically active compounds. And so it gets extremely complicated and weedy, no pun intended. For instance, beta-caryophyllene is a really common terpene in cannabis. It smells kind of like skunk, and it directly stimulates the CB2 receptor. And so it gets you high, sort of. And so there's that one. And then there are other ones that affect reuptake or absorption. They can affect the way that your blood vessels respond. And so, and the interesting thing about terpenes is that they require so few molecules to have an effect, and they're often very transitory. And so you can say, you can sniff menthol, for instance, which is a terpene, a refined terpene, and it'll dilate your blood vessels, but it won't enter your bloodstream. And so no one can measure it and say, oh, this is creating this like pharmacokinetic effect, but it does have an effect on the way that your body is functioning. It's just not really measurable through pharmacokinetic analysis, where they take your blood and then they see how slowly the level of that compound dips, because they're so active at such small amounts. And so these terpenes are affecting reuptake, they're affecting absorption, they're affecting metabolism of the cannabinoids, and we haven't really teased apart how and why in different ratios. But everyone seems to agree that there's a difference between smoking OG Kush and Blue Dream and Colombian Gold. And there's really no explanation besides the terpenes.
There's such a heavy emphasis on keeping the terpenes in these extracts and other products. But as you just mentioned, you can have the essential oils on your skin or have a diffuser in your house to then have or tweak your high for these specific reasons as well. Could you comment on intervention through the direct product versus just having a battery of essential oils that you could use in the diffuser, for instance?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit of a different animal, because you're not, and I think that there's a way that you can tweak your high by using essential oils or a diffuser, or and I think that that's great. But there's something special about keeping it all in the plant or keeping it all in the extract, because, like I said, we just don't know enough. And essential oils are highly refined. They're usually down to 1 or 2 terpenes. And so, you know, like I said, we've got 42 plus terpenes in our extracts. And so it's a polypharmacy that you cannot replicate in your diffuser or through some sort of tincture or extract other than cannabis.
You alluded to this earlier, but can you explain the entourage effect and additionally how that might relate to terpenes and to flavonoids?
Yeah, and so the entourage effect is just a sort of a blanket term for how chemicals besides THC are mixed together to alter the way that we would perceive the high or the medicinal effects of cannabis. And so it's what I mentioned earlier of like these terpenes affecting the reuptake, affecting the absorption, affecting the metabolism, and the different cannabinoids also doing the same thing. Like CBD can affect the way that THC is metabolized and is used by the body, and probably so can a lot of the other minor cannabinoids. We just don't know enough yet. And so the entourage effect is alluding to this idea of polypharmacy, where you're taking more than one pharmacologically active substance in at once, and it's going to be more varied and probably more diverse and medicinally useful than THC taken alone.
So how do you feel about these compounds being reintroduced? Right, like how does that, what's your confidence in the entourage effect? Like what are we missing out on?
I think that if you have, say, THC distillate and someone mixes in beta-caryophyllene, first of all, I want to know how they got the beta-caryophyllene out of whatever substance they did. Like, did they get it from oregano? And did they use a hexane extraction? Like, is there residual hexane? Like, I get in the weeds there a lot. And are those terpenes safe? A lot of them are not regulated in the same way that cannabis extracts are, at least in Oregon. And so it's a little bit horrifying because, you know, they're using toxic substances and then people are inhaling them or incinerating them, and that's scary. But we don't know, but it's probably more nuanced than just taking THC alone. Like we know that these substances do that. It's sort of like the difference between taking Sudafed versus taking NyQuil. You know, there's definitely a difference that you can't peel all of the layers apart when you take NyQuil, because there's like up, down, sideways. There's stuff that's not like intoxicating in NyQuil, but there's stuff that is, you know, and so it's like the joy of polypharmacy, which drives Western scientists and doctors nuts because there's too many variables, and then the way your liver engages with all those compounds gets way complicated.
And is it less complicated in Eastern medicine?
No, not at all. They don't care as much because the polypharmacies that we use have been studied for so long that it's well established what like those 12 herbs do together. And there's a purpose for each of those 12 herbs. And so when you study herbal formulas, you know, it's like this herb is the chief, and then you have this herb that does this. And so it's like, these are tested polypharmaceutical interventions as opposed to, you know, I mean, NyQuil's pretty young in comparison to the Chinese herbal formulas that have been around for 3,000 years. And so that's another way that like Western medicine really freaks out, is about Chinese herbal formulas. My doctors always freak out. They're like, what herbs are you on? And I'm like, I'm on these 12. And sometimes I change them based on what's going on. And they're just like, like, this is not, it's really not that scary, I promise.
Okay, what's your replacement for NyQuil?
There isn't really one, actually. Chinese medicine totally loves mixing cold medicines with Chinese herbal formulas for colds. Typically, though, Chinese herbal formulas will attenuate a virus pretty nicely, so you don't usually need NyQuil. I used to get like 3 or 4 colds a year, and now I get one every 2 or 3 years now because I have the herbs that I take when I first get that throat tickle, and then it just like nukes it with the antiviral herbs.
What are some of those herbs?
Lian Chao, which is forsythia, and Jininhua, which is the very teeny tips of the honeysuckle. It's pretty common that if you look at like the way that a plant grows, when it's most vulnerable to attack from virus and bacteria, those are where those compounds are concentrated. And so like as a honeysuckle plant is first putting out those little tiny new shoots, it's really vulnerable to attack. And so that's where all of those compounds are concentrated. And so the Jininhua, the little, and it has to be harvested within like a 3 or 4 day period every year to get it exactly when it's growing that way. But it's extremely high in antiviral compounds, and it works great.
I know we could get on herbs forever. There are tons and tons, and they're really cool. And like you said, there's an appreciation for polypharmacy that isn't in Western medicine. But another aspect of the endocannabinoid system and its intervention is through acupuncture. And that's an emerging story that's emerging only in the past few years.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you want to comment on how acupuncture and the endocannabinoid system are overlapping and what that story is looking like.
Yeah, I mean, it seems that acupuncture elicits at least part of its effects through the endocannabinoid system. There's definitely been assays where they determine that endorphins and endogenous opioids are also influenced by acupuncture needles, but absolutely the CB2 and CB1 receptors are directly impacted by acupuncture needles, which is, you know, it goes a long way to explain why when people leave my office, they're like not able to pay me because they're like kind of disoriented and like a little gacked out and, you know, acting pretty high.
Can you just rewind that and explain a little bit more of what that actually means?
So
Like,
we have in our own bodies these chemicals that, you know, they're released in order to modulate our homeostasis. And so, for instance, if we're walking along, picking some flowers, enjoying ourselves, and then suddenly a bear comes out of the bushes, all of these chemicals will mobilize to speed our heart rate, perfuse our muscles with blood so that we can run really fast and get away from the bear. And another analogous situation would be, you know, you break your leg, you need something that's within your body to help you manage that pain so that you can function. And so there are chemicals that are called endogenous opioids that are released in order to blunt your pain response. And the endocannabinoid system seems to be more about regulation. It seems to be more about like the perception of different strength of signals to the body. And so it regulates appetite, pain, sleep, all sorts of stuff. And so with acupuncture, some points, a lot of points, it seems, when you put a needle in them, it stimulates the release of our endogenous cannabinoids, like anandamide. And so, yeah, that seems to be what it's doing. So it's basically getting high without putting anything in your body.
Dope. I have a question from the audience I want to hop back to. I think we kind of touched on this, but I want to do it justice. So how do you feel about the movement towards isolating each compound, then mixing them on the back end, like a synthetic strain?
I don't love it. I think it's necessary. I mean, we do it in the case of our hemp products because we need to have stuff that we can mail worldwide and all 50 states. So it needs to have the THC removed. And I personally find distillates to be scary because of the heat that's used to make them. And I worry about there being levels of acrylamide that would be unacceptable and other compounds that are made when you heat substances up. And so I actually prefer isolates to distillates, but there's a lot of arguments that could be made in both directions. So I think it's better than nothing, but I still prefer the whole plant. And it's borne out in every situation that I've encountered with our company that you can use a lower dose of whatever target cannabinoid you want if it's combined in a whole plant way. People who take CBD isolate need more CBD than they do if it's mixed with other minor cannabinoids and terpenes. And the efficacy is better and it tends to be more versatile for different issues if you have different terpenes. So, I mean, CBD is just kind of like straight ahead, whereas if you have it mixed or if you leave it with the original plant material, it's more versatile.
My opinion on that is the introduction of terpenes, making synthetic strains, whatever you want to call it, is necessary for scalability. And there will always be a market for what I'll call craft, where it's just kind of whole plant. Same as there's a market for Eastern and Western medicine, and
right.
Western medicine is pumped out in this country, and there's a ton of it. It's very scalable and consistent. But there's also an advantage to the other world. So I think of them as two sides of the same coin.
I agree. I mean, what we do is a pain in the ass. It takes a lot more time, it takes a lot more effort. There's more things that can go wrong along the way. And so, yes, for scalability and for more access, I agree with you. And I do think that they're two really distinct things. And that's the only beef I have, is that it's just not comparable. And like I said, it's way better than nothing. But it's like you said, two things.
Are you seeing kind of an uptake in cannabis companies kind of creating designer strains with terpenes, flavonoids, cannabinoids versus just coming from the plant?
Yeah, in Oregon there was a lot of that, and then they cracked down because there wasn't any regulation on the added flavors or terpenes or whatever, and people got pretty craven, and they were introducing some things that were genuinely hazardous, and so the regulatory body here cracked down on it, which is good, because I was really scared that people were going to end up in the hospital if they hadn't already. I'm sure some did. Like, you shouldn't be incinerating MCT coconut oil, and people were using MCT coconut oil to cut their extract in a vape pen, and that's just a terrible idea. So as long as people are doing it correctly, cool.
Yeah, I actually saw, was it on the blacklist of people taking actually hemp plants and spraying them with distillate and terpenes and passing it off as marijuana. So I thought that was kind of like, interesting.
But yeah, I mean, that I'm not shocked at all. I mean, how different is that from like putting a bunch of hash in a bowl of shitty weed? Which I'm definitely old enough to have done, by the way. So.
Really quickly, just we have a person who's asking, can you explain the difference between an isolate and distillate?
Yeah, so a distillate is formed by taking a raw extract, whether it's ethanol or CO2, and heating it under a vacuum until the volatile desired compounds are boiled off and or vaporized and then collected through a still. It's sort of like making whiskey. Like you've got the mash, and then you boil it up and you collect the alcohol from the other side. And so in this case, you're collecting the THC or the CBD, and you're trying to not collect anything else, but you get some other stuff coming in. But and so that is a really viscous, sticky, off white, yellow, clear sort of situation, a distillate. And then when you dissolve the distillate, typically in pentane, the desired hydrocarbon, or excuse me, the desired cannabinoid precipitates out, and you're able to filter it or run it through a centrifuge and pull out the crystallized isolate. And so distillate can range from, the grossest stuff is like 70% cannabinoids, and then up to like 98% if they do it really well and they start with good material. Versus isolate is almost always like 98, 99. Some of the isolate that we've been working with is 99.8% CBD. And so it's very, very pure. Chances are it's just going to be the cannabinoid and like a little bit of residual pentane, like 5 parts per million or 5 parts for, no, hopefully less than that, but yeah. But it's very, very pure. It's a white powder. It looks really sketchy.
No, I'm glad that you guys, are talking about isolate, because I think like isolate was getting a lot of hate for a little bit. But we do have a lot of friends that are doing products with beauty, products with that where consistency, like Jacoby was talking about, is really needed. So I'm glad that you can't do consistent skincare or regulated healthcare with variables that happen a lot with natural plants. So like that's cool. I'm glad that isolate is still alive. My partner is actually allergic to some of the terpenes. So when he smokes flower, even if he smokes some of the vape, he gets an allergic reaction. So, with some of the isolate CBD stuff that we've been taking, it hasn't affected him. So that's cool to know.
Yeah, that's great. I'm actually, pretty pro isolate for that reason. It's super easy to work with. It's highly soluble in like alcohol and oil, and it's super easy to do calculations. There's so much variability with extracts with CO2. We have to homogenize it really well in order to figure out exactly how potent it is. And even the assays are usually off because they can't really measure it as well as they can with isolate. So you can just do a serial dilution with isolate, and it's like, oh, magic, everything comes out exactly like I planned.
I have another question from our audience, and this is something we were talking about earlier, but it relates to all the variables in polypharma. So how can polypharma be reliably studied when there are so many variables?
Well, you can isolate all the other variables. Get rid of things like time of day, stomach contents, other pharmaceutical interventions that someone's having, and then just make sure that you are getting the same phenotype of the same genotype and then administering it consistently, which is tricky with smoking because people inhale and hold very differently from each other. And so, it is tough, but you just have to winnow those variables down and then study them in large enough groups.
I want to ask a quick question, just because I know you're not a doctor and this isn't medical advice, but as a patient yourself who experimented with cannabis, do you have any guidelines or recommendations on how an individual who may be suffering from whatever disorder can go about experimenting and figuring out what works for them?
Yeah, I think that for a completely novice user, I have different advice than someone who's used cannabis recreationally or has experimented with it. Because by the time someone comes to me and asks me about these things, often they've experimented a lot or not at all. And so if someone's experimented not at all, I usually recommend that they start with something that's CBD based that has just a teeny tiny amount of THC, like less than 2% in the total extract. And then that allows them to get sort of their feet wet. Because what I don't want is for someone to get really uncomfortable and experience the high for the first time and panic and be taken off guard. And so usually I move from CBD to THC, however they need it, and other minor cannabinoids. Whereas if someone is like, yeah, no, I smoked weed in college, this is fine. It really depends on what ailment they have. I've had a lot of really good luck with all the blueberry constellation of strains for abdominal pain and discomfort. Whatever the terpene profile's in there, probably a lot of myrcene, but also some of the more up terpenes help me with the gut pain and spasm without really sedating me. So it allows me to be functional during the day. And so if people are having menstrual cramps or endometriosis, that's usually where I point them, is the blue label. And that's why we have a color coding system, is that we can sort of point people towards what they're probably going to want. And then if they don't remember what strain they had, they can still buy the same color and it'll have fairly consistent effects.
I have one last question for you, Katie. With how, you know, there's a lot of anxiety and nervousness and unknowns during COVID, what would you recommend as a good strain, and maybe in conjunction with an herb that's readily available, that would be a good way to kind of ease anxiety and kind of chill a little bit from especially everything that's happening in Portland? What have you been recommending?
Yeah, no kidding. For anxiety, I love, in the Western herbal land, I really love passion flower and hop strobial. Both of those have GABA agonists, so they act on sort of like the opposite of adrenaline. It's like the GABA is kind of the brakes of the nervous system. It just helps you chill out. I recommend those. You can get those without a prescription. There are a couple of Chinese formulas that I really liked. Swanzhou Rentong has been flying out of my pharmacy lately, but you need a prescription for that. But it's not super hard to come by. If you have a Chinese herbalist or if you go into a Chinese herbal shop, it's there and you can just ask for it. In terms of strains, the one that I've been recommending the most is our hemp special sauce tincture for people who are in New York. And if you're in Oregon, it's a different discussion, but not that many people are in Oregon. And so the special sauce is really nice and medium sedating, but you know, won't knock you out, but it also is chill. The sour space candy is also really fun for like daytime. It's a little bit more uplifting. And so if you're having more struggles with depression, that's what I would recommend as opposed to anxiety. You know, it's kind of like gets you a little bit either higher or lower, depending on where you're at for the day.
And you guys are making CBD products. Where can, you know, folks on the East Coast get your products?
It's all online. We've got an online shop now, and there's tinctures and chocolates are coming soon. The topicals have been really successful, but we're going to be doing and there's a new lotion coming out in about a month, and all of our strain specific and different cannabinoid profile chocolates are coming out in the next 6 weeks.
And that's at peakextracts.com.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Katie, for your time. This hour went by really fast. I think there's, we all love science and we love love extraction. And so thank you for shedding light to many of the things that, you know, that we always get questions about. So yeah, thank you. And thank the audience for giving us your Friday afternoon. And next week, we're going to be featuring Andrew D'Angelo, co-founder of Harborside and also Last Prisoner Project. So we'll see everyone next week.
Thank you so much. I love nerding out with all of you.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you so much. So much fun.
And take it away, DJ O.